This is the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, a discussion of the 2018 Eisner Award nominations in the Early Readers, Kids, and Teens categories.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Gwen.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics for young readers.
On this episode of the Comics Alternative Young Readers Show, we're going to be reviewing all of the nominees for the 3 Young Readers categories of the 2018 Eisner Awards.
Yeah, Gwen, as this is always an exciting episode, that means we're going to talk about the 5 books nominated for Best Publication for Early Readers, which is up to age 8, the 5 books nominated for the Best Publication for Kids, ages 9 to 12, and the 6 titles nominated for Best Publication for Teens, ages 13 to 17.
That's right. This is really the Oscars of the comics world, so it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yep.
Well, before we start today's show, I must tell you I'm wearing my evening gown, Paul, and I have a tiara. All right. But before we start the festivities today, I want to remind everyone that our program is sponsored by Discount Comic Book Service. Head over to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. Every week, DCBS has DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles for 40% off. And many other publishers' comics regularly run between 20 and 35% off the list price. In fact, DCBS has some specials that run 45 to 50% off the cover price, and often the discounts are more impressive than that. So, head over to dcbservice.com or their sister site, In Stock Trades, for all of your comics needs.
In the month of May, for instance, you can get the DC Kids bundle that has Looney Tunes number 244 and Scooby-Doo Team Up number 40 for $2.98, 50% off the cover price. I mean, you can't beat that deal.
That is if you really think about it, that's like 1/3 of an hour of babysitting.
Right.
I mean, seriously.
How much entertainment and pleasure are you going to get out of that?
That's right. You can read them to the kids you babysit, right?
That's right. There you go. And you can also find other bundles. For instance, the DC Young Animal bundle has Cave Carson has an Interstellar Eye number 5 and Eternity Girl number 5, a great series, and Mother Panic Gotham AD number 5 and Shade the Changing Woman number 5. And you get all those comics for just $7.96, a savings of 50%. And that's just a picture of the great deals and other excellent discounts that you're going to get on comics for all ages at Discount Comic Book Service.
That is so correct. And when you order with DCB Service, be sure to tell them that Paul and Gwen sent you.
Yeah, take the time. Send them a message. We'd appreciate that.
Well, Paul, it is our annual, now very definite tradition in the Young Reader Show to review the Eisner nominated titles for the Young Reader categories. And nominees are typically announced in early May. Winners are then announced or awarded at the San Diego Comic-Con in July. So we really want to begin our show with a congratulations to everyone who has been nominated, all of the creators and the publishers who support them.
Absolutely. And we're so excited for these texts. I am dressed in a tuxedo in my study here. No, but seriously, these, looking through these texts is always it's just kind of opportunity to look at some of the best of what's out there in kids comics. And for people as invested in the field as you and I are, this is just great fun and really gratifying. And so we really want to thank the publishers and the creators who sent us review copies of the titles we're reviewing today. We got a lot of them to talk about. This is going to be, I think, a gargantuan show. And we have read and enjoyed these titles, and we're really grateful for the chance to review them here. And indeed, I think every one of them, although we'll certainly talk a little bit about the categories and the meanings of the categories, every one of them do deserve the acknowledgement that the panel of Eisner judges has afforded them. So glad to do this, and let's roll up our sleeves, Gwen. We got a lot to talk about.
We do. So we're going to start off with best publication for what the Eisners term early readers, and this is kids up to the age of 8, and that is actually a pretty broad category. It is. I mean, when you stop and think about it, Paul, this is, everything from wordless, almost picture books, all the way up to some very sophisticated comics. Some, for instance, Goodnight Planet by Liniers that we talked about earlier this year is a pretty sophisticated comic. So this is the one designation where I think we have probably the broadest range in terms of how readership is envisaged.
Yeah. I think that, there's definitely a lot of levels between 0 and 8. And not only that, we're looking at a moment when I think the emergence of kids comics in the comics market, I mean, obviously comics have always been appealing to kids, but now they're so prominent and they're so, there's so much, I think, a point of attraction. You go to a library and the graphic novels section is growing. You go into a bookstore and a lot of the bestsellers are the kinds of either comics or hybrid texts that you and I have talked so often about on the show. And it's becoming such an important presence in children's literature that I think that the category reflects some of the ways that comics are bleeding into picture books and children's books are drawing on some of the affordances of comics and things like that. So it's a really fascinating category, not only because each individual book is so interesting, but also as a picture of this, increasingly blended territory.
Absolutely. And in the show notes, you'll find the full listing of all of the nominees. But the way that Paul and I are going to do this is to just start and go through title by title. So the first title that we want to talk about is Adele in Sandland. And it's by Claude Ponti. It's translated by Skeeter Grant and Françoise Mouly. This is, of course, out of Toon Books, which is Françoise Mouly's wonderful comics imprint. And this is an exceptionally beautiful book. It's one of many of the books that we're going to be talking about today that rests its strength on just an incredible mise en scene, a beautiful depiction of both sort of urban, what looks to be New York City or Paris, one of a sort of a large metropolitan area, but that morphs into this amazing fantasy land where a young girl who looks to be, what do you think, Paul, maybe four years old, maybe 3 or 4. She goes to play in the sandbox with her friends while the mothers and fathers sit around the sandbox, and that's a very typical scene. I'm sure, Paul, that's played out in your life more than once.
Oh, sure has.
And
all the time.
but this is not just any sandbox. This is a sandbox that morphs into what really turns out to be a fantasy adventure for Adele. It's an incredibly colorful book. It's as if we took Winsor McKay, who's known for Nemo in Slumberland, and Alice in Wonderland. If they had a 21st century sort of combination, this is what it would be. It's really a beautiful book. What were your thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, I felt the same. Actually, those same references, McKay's Little Nemo in Slumberland, surely a reference point. Alice, Lewis Carroll's Alice, also a reference point in the sense of the fantastical characters and creatures and their strange configurations together that Adele encounters after what starts as a pretty everyday trip to the playground. And you're absolutely right that the mise en scene is significant here, because this is a level 1 Toon book, and Toon helpfully levels its books so that you can know how much text there is and what lexile it's supposed to appeal to. And level 1 is for grades K through 1, and so there are just 200 to 300 easy sight words, but there is a feast for a young reader's eyes to take in on every single page. Just a scene of, for instance, the park, or a scene of the Arctic iceberg that somehow, Adele lands on. All of them are a feast for the eyes, and you can spend really almost limitless time because just staring at each picture, because there are there are illustrations that are populated by kids doing a bajillion things around the monkey bars, and you can just imagine each of them and the kind of playful encounters that they're having at the playground. You can spend time staring at the sort of gnome-like creatures that appear as Adele's flights of fancy take her to these different places. You can spend time pondering this language, which is very rich. Some of it, again, playful, some of it prophetic, which has an interesting relationship to the for instance, the one page where there's a croissant that seems like a moon, or another place where a nose becomes a spaceship. So there's just a lot going on in this book that I can imagine a kid spending a lot of time in.
I was actually surprised that it was a level 1. I've done a lot of work with Toon books recently. I've been writing on them for a book that I'm writing, and I was really taken aback when I actually saw that it was a 1, because to me, it feels much more like a level 2 or 3. And I know that one of the ways that they designate this are the number of panels on the page. And that is an important designation. Obviously, if there are, if there's a lot of confusion on the page, it's going to be harder for a beginning reader to understand. But this is a really sophisticated comic. So I want to encourage our listeners. I would say that this would be appropriate for really not only any kid within this range, but it's so beautiful and so fanciful. I could see almost any comics reader really enjoying the text.
Yeah. And don't let it fool you that it only has that 1 or 2 panels per page. There's some sophisticated sort of comics semiotics, if I can throw that word out, going on. There's pages where this comics trick where it's actually, in terms of the scene, in terms of the setting, it's like one single illustration, but they're broken into 2 or 3 panels, and in each one, Adele is moving across the scene so that the panel break conveys the passage of time, but through what would seem like one fixed scene, right? And then there's other places where, it is a single page spread, but there's so much activity going on within that single page that it suggests motion and stuff like that. And I think you're right. I think that this is something that, I guess I'd put it this way. It'd be really satisfying for more sophisticated readers as well.
Right. I'm currently doing some work on this idea of busyness in children's comics and the significance of busy panels and what authors are perhaps attempting to convey, or more importantly, perhaps are trying to get kids to do. In other words, to pay attention, to focus. And there's so much that could attract a child's attention that this is one of those books where if the child is being chaperoned through the text, I could see a parent and a child, or a teacher and a child, sitting there and going through, just one page has a wealth of details, as you were pointing out. So it's one of those really interesting comics that's going to become part of my study on busyness, I think. I would put this right up there with a Hilda comic, by Luke Peterson in terms of it's but it's busyness, but with a purpose. And it's really a beautiful text too. Just from artistic, we really haven't even talked about that much. It has a real feeling to me of art that featured children in the 1920s, 1930s, sort of early 20th century depictions of children. And yet there's this sort of 21st century swagger about the kids too. So it's not like it's the Campbell Soup Kids Have an Adventure, but there is that kind of drawing style as well, which is really appealing.
Yeah. I really associate that with McKay as well, but it's also, McKay is drawing from illustration of the time, so it definitely has that style. But you're right, a very modern sensibility attached to that. And, just to give away the last line of the book, Adele sort of returns to terra firma, returns to regular world. And it says, Mama says it's snack time, but Adele says, no, thank you, I'm full. And given the sort of, ornate and fantastic experience she's just had with a sort of indescribable mix of strangeness and wonder, it makes sense that she's full and satisfied. And I think that's, in this slim volume, it really accomplishes all of that. So I definitely enjoy this. It's worth mentioning that this, that Ponti, the creator, the author here, has been doing children's books in French for quite a long time. In fact, his first picture book about Adele, who was named for his daughter, came out in 1985. And so there's also a longevity to this, a lineage to this that's really interesting. So good on Toon Books once again, for another fantastic work.
Yay.
Well, speaking of fantastic works, the next nominee in this category, again, I feel like I should be pulling out an envelope and wearing a tux. But the next nominee in this category is Arthur and the Golden Rope, which is subtitled Brownstone's Mythical Collection, and it's by Joe Todd-Stanton from Flying Eye Books, which is a division of Nobrow. And when we open the book, we find we encounter an old man with a mustache and beard who is introducing us to the Brownstone Family Vault, which is a library of books of tales. And we meet Arthur, who's born in an Icelandic town and given a magic feather, and that gives a suggestion of where the adventures go from there. It's a beautifully illustrated book that combines sort of the world of Iceland and the world of the Norse mythology. And in some places, it's more like an illustrated text or like a children's book, and other places sequential panels really do the storytelling, which kind of comes back to what we talked about at the beginning of this, the way that there is maybe some definition fuzziness about the way that this book works. It's clearly comics in some places, and in other places seems to operate more like a children's book. Either way, it's absolutely beautiful. Gwen, what was your experience of this adventure?
Well, I have to laugh because I've been doing a lot of work with Neil Gaiman recently, and of course he has Norse mythology out. So I was thinking, this is what you could hand to your kid while you're reading
This
Norse
is
mythology.
The kid version. Yeah.
But,
Valhalla and everything. Yep.
Right. This is really an interesting text because in some ways it's the traditional quest narrative where the child who's seems least likely to be able to save the day actually manages to, and it's because he is observant and he is also, I think, he feels a sense of responsibility to his community. And I thought it was a beautifully drawn text. I agree with you. There was, for me, and this isn't a critique of the text so much as it is, there are times when I don't notice the speech bubbles in a comic where they're so integrated that I don't even really think about them. But with this text, the illustrations are so rich and the colors are so, the tone is so sort of almost a sepia tone almost. It's an incredibly sort of intense visual experience. And then some of the speech bubbles are white with, the sort of strong font on it that is really jarring in relation to the images. So that's my only small point about this text. And when you were talking about sort of its hybridity, that was sort of a feeling to me. There was just a little bit of a point of like, I'm wondering if some other more perhaps comic creator oriented person would have integrated those speech bubbles in a way that made them not so different from the mood that's being created by the rest of the comic. But that said, I loved this story. I went into it with a bit of, another cute little boy going on a quest story. Right. But actually, the society that's drawn here is fascinating. There's a certain amount of gender equality going on within people's professions within the town. And Arthur himself is a very sweet kid. I mean, there's just a way in which he's drawn that it just makes him seem very identifiable for, I think, almost any kid who has always wanted to sort of go out and have a big adventure. The kids who tie the tablecloth around their neck and run out like they're a superhero. This is that kind of kid, but he actually manages to do something really significant.
Yeah. The story is great fun. Arthur is a very appealing character. And I thought that the worlds that he encounters and the ways that the sort of societies are set up and, particularly in regards to gender, are a way that this text takes a lot of things that we had as kids and gives us things we didn't have as kids, pictures of societies that are different from, that are more akin to what we are and what we hope to be, I think. But I would have to say the thing that took me about this text was, when we were kids, I remember a really good book cover. And it didn't matter if it was a fantasy or a child's version of a mystery, but a book cover that grabbed you and that sort of hinted at the imaginative quality of the world that we would find in the text. And I'm not talking about comics. I'm talking about, prose texts.
Right.
And what this book was like to me was like page after page of those kinds of wonderful book covers. And, I think, we will gush over the art in many of these books that we talk about today. I would say that this, among all of the youngest readers, what is the category called? The early readers comics,
early readers, yeah,
was the art that I was most taken with, because of that quality. For instance, there's a page where Arthur is in trouble, and then Windweaver, who's a red giant bird, sort of, I'm not sure what kind of bird this is, but swoops down and catches him by her talons and carries her away. And just that page, which is page 40 in the text, just that page is not only Windweaver, the bird, and Arthur, who has this brilliant look on his face of wow, I'm being swept away. But just the design of the page with the kind of sort of gnarled tree encircling the image, and then these little branches coming out with these mysterious bottles, jars that are part of what that Windweaver hands to Arthur to hand to Thor. Anyway, as I'm describing it, you can hear that there's a sort of mythological quality about it that seems like a really beautiful book cover. And then you sort of get page after page of these images accompanying the story, the text. And so that's where I think that just the visual lusciousness of this text was what really grabbed me, recommended it to me the most. And I just imagine kids' imaginations and really their sort of hunger to depict and to draw really being whetted by this book. And it really is a visual feast.
Well, there is a library in it that's drawn with such detail. I was in a hurry reading these books, obviously, because that's one of a million things I'm doing. Here, just read 15 books on top of, all the other stuff I'm doing. But I have to say that I paused at that page. And also there's another page a little earlier in the text where Arthur is sailing away from his island in order to go on this quest. And the way that it's drawn, it's a 2-page spread, and it's the ship going across. You can see where Arthur has been and the sort of little divergent things that happen to him, or diverse things, I should say, that happen to him before he gets to the shore. And that's a page that both is, I think, addressing literacy by, asking kids to pay attention to where something happens, and you have that forward motion that you had been talking about with Adele and Sandland happening in that spread as well. But it's also just such a rich page with such detail. That's a thing about this comic as well. There's just such a strength in establishing the mise-en-scene, and it's absolutely lovely.
It is. Yeah.
My allergy-laden voice isn't doing it any favors, but
no, not at all.
But I will say that I really thought of all of the books that we read. This one, along with Bolivar, which we're going to be talking about in the next category, really for me are the kinds of texts that I know that when I was a kid, I would have absolutely obsessed on the images in the text. And so,
Yeah, agree. Yeah. And that library shot, indeed, that's like the stuff as a kid. I mean, that's, I think, a glimpse of what this book is, really the framing sequences where there's the man I said at the beginning who welcomes the dear reader into the vault, and the vault is really a bunch of treasures, but the treasures all point to kind of stories. And I think that promise of a giant shelves full of stories is really explored in this book, really manifested in this book.
Yep, absolutely. Well, our next text is Egg, or Egg, depending upon what part of the country you grew up in. I started off on the East Coast and then moved further west. So did you say egg? I said egg. Is it? Egg. Oh, I got it. Okay. That's how I learned to say it. But now that I live in the Midwest, I have to be really careful and say egg. But I have to actually think about it. It's like I say literature, and I don't mean to, but that's just how I learned it as a kid. And people notice that, and it always makes me so self-conscious. So when you wanted me to introduce this one, I'm like, oh, great.
That's
egg. Well, Egg has a lot of eggs in it. So let me just start off by saying that. This is by Kevin Henkes. This is out of Greenwillow Books, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. And it is one of those books that I think brings to mind maybe the first one that we've been looking at in a really serious way, this concept of hybridity.
Yeah.
And I say that because as someone who teaches picture books and has studied picture books, we're always sort of interested in what is the difference between a picture book and a comic. And lots of theorists have talked about, looked at it from a number of angles is the book something that a child can read on its own, or is there an assumed chaperone? If there's an assumed chaperone, perhaps we're thinking this is closer to a picture book. We also think about it in relationship to words, to lexile, to sort of the way that things are set out, page layout. Now, there are panels in this comic, and in fact, some of the transition pages have as many as 16 panels on them. So it's definitely in some ways engaging in many of the conventions of comics grammar and comics format, but there are other ways in which it seems to feel, at least to me, very much like a picture book. It's, the vocabulary is usually there's no more than one word per page. I'm actually sitting here. I'm sorry for the noise. Usually we try not to go through the books when we're recording because the microphone will pick it up, even though, because I'm right by the mic. But it's one of those sort of sweet texts where things really do happen. I mean, this is a story about 4 eggs, and 3 of them hatch, and one of them is just resistant to hatching. And the other birds who have already hatched get this idea that they want to help that last egg. And there's this wonderful sequence where after the other birds have hatched and said goodbye, right, there's this last egg, and there's this wonderful page where there's these, 16 panels, and it's just the egg with the word waiting on it. And there's absolutely no sort of change whatsoever in the egg or in the words behind it. And then basically you get because nothing is happening, the little birds come back and decide to try and help out. There's a definite surprise at the end of this text, and it's a sweet surprise. And it's a beautiful book visually. It's very simple, clear line drawings. Very, it's one of those books where if I think you were transitioning a child from picture books to comics, this would be a wonderful selection.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right that this is the book that brings up the questions about which category, if we're, strict about categorizing, that this belongs in. Henkes known for picture books like Kitten's First Full Moon or Olive's Ocean. And I remember reading these books with my daughter when she was much younger, And since most of it is communicated by imagery with just like simple accompanying words, there's something about it that does feel like the very, very earliest, moving from board books, I'd say, to like sort of the bigger picture books, that kind of transition. And so I did ask myself, because I associate Henkes and I associate this text, and we should say it's from Greenwillow Books, with more with that kind of book and not so much with comics. It really forced me to ask myself what aspects of that comics grammar you were saying, the sort of conventions, the visual conventions, is this book employing that make it qualify as comics? And, so for the very, very earliest readers, is there something in the tools of comics, which is something I think about in terms of, I think it's interesting to think about how these books mix the different kinds of texts. Is there something about the tools of comics that this book is making use of? And one of the things that it uses, as you were pointing out in those pages that you described, is that the size of panels and their sequence, their arrangement on the page can say a lot about time. And the amount of time that's transpired. And I think that translation, that metaphor for kids, even at the youngest ages, is something that they can start picking up from a text like this. It's that waiting for the egg to crack. And the 16 panels that are near identical of just an egg and the word waiting convey in one page this slow passage of time. And I think that's a wonderful quality that this text has picked up alongside Henkes' drawings, which drawings is maybe not fair. This is really great use of color. Really nice, not only palette, but also, I'm not sure what tool quite this is, but it's very simple, but it's kind of great for young kids to associate with this mix of colors together with these birds staring at these eggs. And so, yeah, all those qualities in terms of the visual communication that's going on make this, I think, worthy for consideration in this category with other books that are maybe more traditionally comics.
Right. And it also gets into sort of the idea of us thinking about, maybe comics that might have been in this category and that weren't there. So, and I don't really want to go down that road, but I will say that if I had been handed this book, I would have easily seen it being looked at in an award for a Caldecott, which is the ALA award for the best illustrated book. But it definitely does have many comics elements, and it does have a very sweet sort of end point, which I really don't want to give it away because it is an adorable book. And I think that this would be especially good for the youngest readers. And I don't know if they'd be listening to our show, but their family or their teachers might be. So
yes, it is a good book. Yeah, agree with you. And also because, again, without giving away where it's going, the sort of sense of like an egg and waiting for what that represents, another person to come into the world. And I can imagine a 2-year-old with a little sibling on the way, sort of like thinking about that. And then so where the story, it's such a simple story. I mean, really it's one word per page kind of thing, but the variety of feelings that you have as you wait for this creature to come, and just the universality of that experience of waiting for the egg and what that might represent to a kid. So interesting. So, in that sense, it's also just in terms of theme, touching on something really interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's a lot of fun. I mean, I think that egg book is I think an example of something that maybe we don't necessarily think of as comics becoming comics. The next title, Little Tales in the Savannah, is different from Egg, but also does some interesting mixing and combining of what we normally think of as not comics with comics. Little Tales in the Savannah is from Lion Forge Magnetic, and it's by Frederic, Brrémaud, and Federico Bertolucci, translated by Mike Kennedy. And it's actually the third volume of the Little Tales series of books, in which we meet these two little foxes, I think they are, and they take us to visit various parts of the world where their exploits allow us an opportunity to meet different animals and creatures that are part of that specific setting. And in this case, we have Little Tales in the Savannah. Now, Gwen, you didn't get a chance to review this text, right?
I did not. But I did a little bit of research online. To me, it felt very much like science comics with like much more of a narrative frame. In other words, it's like instead of, and in some ways, some of the science comics have been structured in this way of having someone sort of become the curator of, or the sort of introducer of a particular ecosystem or scientific process. And so that was it. But I was also sort of, I really liked the way that the principal characters are drawn. And we probably should say, if you're entirely unfamiliar with this series, that Tales is spelled Tails. So it's Little Tales as well as a tail. And
that's right.
And I thought that was kind of a cute play on words as well. But why don't you give us a sense? Did you read this with your daughter by any chance?
Not this one, but we've read one of the prior volumes in this series. Yeah. And she loved it. And really what it is it's exactly as you say, like science comics, but probably for a younger set. Mm-hmm. There is a narrative piece, and then there is these gorgeous illustrations of animals, the kinds that, like if this were a book just of paintings of animals, that would have its appeal, right? Mm-hmm. If this were a book just of a narrative of two super cute, sort of like, they look like the two characters in Mutts, for instance.
That's what I was thinking. I wasn't going to say that, but that's exactly what I was thinking. Okay.
Yeah. Some similar art style, and also just the liveliness in an animated quality of their characterization and their funny back and forth and stuff like that. It's those two in parallel. Each page has a painted illustration of, say, a lion and its cub, asleep on the savannah, and then either above it or below it, almost in parallel, this narrative. And the two are intended to not just sit side by side, but really to overlap, that it's as if our two heroes are seeing the picture that we're seeing. The difference is, of course, one is in this very, again, this painted, looks like oil paints sort of style. And, Bertolucci, well known for his series Love, is masterful at painting animals and creatures and nature scenes and things like that, and making them totally beautiful, totally gorgeous. But then there's these sort of 4 panels, of these two characters, like frightened by the snake that they see, or shocked, surprised by the turtle, and you sort of basically encounter these paintings as if they are encountering them in this little tale, this little story of their exploration. So it really becomes a kind of a journey that you go on with them to meet these different animals. And then by the end of it, they go back home to where they live in a living room and read books and stuff like that. So
it turns out okay in the end. Yeah. It
turns out all okay. They're all safe and sound, and they've had this fun exploration. So, I mean, this is where I think the tools of comics, the way that this book combines traditionally picture books and comics, is that the tools of comics are used to almost offer what would be the voiceover of a nature documentary, and that voiceover is done by two characters who really have a story and personality and adventures of their own. So in a sense, it's doing much more than that. And they're interacting with the objects and the paintings, the animals and the paintings in fun ways. And that seems pretty unique to me. I can't think of a parallel where the two kinds of texts are used in quite the same relationship to each other, and I think that's interesting.
I can think of only one. Although I'm sure there are more, Paul, because, we can only read so much. But there is one series that reminds me a little bit of this, just from the few pages that I saw of Little Tales. And that is the Stratford Zoo Midnight Review Presents series, where you have both animals sort of portraying a Shakespearean play on stage, but you have other animals in the audience watching it, commenting on it, and expressing emotion. Now, it is a slightly different setup, but on the other hand, you're basically saying to children who are reading the text, this big Shakespearean play may seem really scary. You may have a lot of questions. The things that are happening on the stage might be violent. I mean, both, I think it's Galliago and, oh my God, I'm forgetting the Lindler and Galliago. They obviously, are interested in or understand the fact that going to a play can be a really frightening experience for a child. They chose tragedies to start off their series, but I think they were trying to demonstrate to adults that kids can watch a tragedy and get something out of it. And so I saw that sort of relationship going on there when I was looking at Little Tales. But just in listening to, having read the entire text, it's clear that some of those same concerns about genre, about looking at a realistic drawing and having certain emotional responses to it. That's something that really goes into the beginnings of art appreciation, or even the appreciation of natural history or whatever for kids. That's part of it. So, I think that makes it a really neat text in terms of also just talking to kids about genre.
For sure. And the distinction between the two parallel, you could say, genres that are going on, that are interweaving in relationship to each other throughout this is very clear because of the artistic contrast. One is a sort of, duotone cartoon is very, very much, like Mutts, use of very simple background or no background sometimes, and shadow, but just very cute animal drawings. And then the other, this sort of very elaborate painting. So it's interesting how kids will make sense of that parallel, and they'll see one as navigating them through the reactions you have to what you're observing, and then the other being the sort of wondrous thing that you're observing. And that combination is a tool of comics that I think is being really usefully put to use here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting text. And it's just, when I read this with my daughter, not this one, but another Little Tales book, she was really drawn to the strips. It was really the comic strip element, the narrative element that made what usually she's not that interested in, which is sort of page after page of pictures of animals, it made those come alive. She was more into the emotional sort of resonance with the cartoons than with the nature scenes. And so it's an interesting conductor in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because my college age students who have read the Stratford Zoo series often tell me that they actually appreciated the discourse going on in the audience more than they did the actual play. And
I'm on the stage.
Great.
Yeah.
but I do kind of get that in a way. And maybe that's one of the things that this author artist team are thinking about as well, is getting kids to recognize certain nuances via a medium they maybe are more comfortable with at this point. And I think that speaks as well to the sort of ubiquity of comics.
Sure.
And at least in the high art realm. I'm not sure how much I think that they're very rarely being used in the classroom. Sadly, we're trying to one person at a time. We're trying to to
win them over.
That's right. But anyway, well, Paul, the next text that we're going to talk about is the first of 4 that we have actually already reviewed. And this is the last entry in the best publication for early readers is Good Night Planet by Liniers. And this is out of Toon Books again, Françoise Mouly's imprint. And this is an adorable story about a little girl who has a beloved stuffed bunny. And this bunny is called Planet. And so in the title, Good Night Planet, this is answering the question that's on the back of the text itself. What happens while you're sleeping? And the answer is your toys go out to play. And in this particular story, Planet is a very charming bunny who has an amazing adventure. And he befriends a dog. He encounters a cookie, and whenever cookies enter a text, I'm excited. And he has some pretty exciting adventures that lead you to realize, in some ways, it sort of turns upside down this idea of imagination. In Adele, for instance, Adele in Sandland, it's clear that this is Adele's imagination that's governing her adventures. In this text, the child goes to sleep and is oblivious to the imaginative life and to the adventures of the toys that maybe while she's awake she would assume would only sort of apprehending the world the way she apprehends the world. And so I found that sort of dual consciousness in this text is really an interesting aspect. This is a level 2 comic, and it certainly does include lots of full page spreads, but also lots of multi-panel comic pages as well. So this was a book that you and I know truly enjoyed, and I was pleased to see it as one of the nominees.
Yeah, I was excited too. It's one of those things where you see the list, you're like, score, we loved that one too. But we will link to our previous review of this book in the show notes as well. So you can definitely listen to that. But I think for me, the new insight of looking at this again, looking at Goodnight Planet again by Liniers, was to have it sit in contrast to the other ones that we talked about, in this category. Because at the time that we read it, I think it was the sole book for that age readers that we were doing in that episode. We weren't contrasting it with others. And what it made me think of is when we talked about this in our original review, Gwen, is that there's a lot of visual callbacks to the Velveteen Rabbit, say, or even that the illustration of that era. And so for an adult reader, for instance, or a parent reading this with a child, or an educator, caretaker reading this with a child, there's a kind of echo, there's a resonance, right, to those texts that we may have encountered as a kid. But what strikes me is that for the kid who's encountering it, it's not an echo of children's books, other children's books of the past. It may actually be a kind of gateway to those kinds of texts, because both in the style of the illustration, even in the font style that Liniers uses, as sort of capital letters with serif, with little legs in the texts, all those are sort of signifying an era of illustration and print that I wonder if this book, sort of opens the gate to looking at those things and not having them seem old and dusty and far off, but actually the stuff of some, my parent or my grandparents, earliest imagination or earliest encounters with texts as well. And it made me think about how many of the books in this category do similar things. Like we were just saying, Little Tales brings us into the, one page painting of animal type book, but the comics mediates that. Or Arthur and the Golden Rope brings us into the, volumes and volumes of fantasies of faraway worlds. But the sort of comics elements bring us into that. And so there's a way where these books not only, are themselves, interesting and fun for kids, but they may also be a kind of gateway, a kind of like, making the visual signifiers of a certain other kind of texts comfortable and interesting and accessible for kids.
Yeah, what's really interesting to me about all 5 of these texts is that it feels to me the one thing that's missing is a text that deals with relationships that children would have in the real world with each other in real time. And that's, I don't know if that's so much as a critique as an observation, because I would say, as we're going to look as we move forward, the best publications for kids aged 9 to 12, almost every book deals with that, although there are a lot of fantasy elements still. In fact, I would say that this is an extremely fantasy heavy list.
You're right.
And actually, interestingly, my particular interests come to the fore when I tell you, and we'll see later on, that my very favorite book of the year is actually a realist text. It's on this list, and it is a realist text. And so, I'm just sort of pointing out, I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been doing a lot of work with the comics for the last 10 years, and I've noticed a real uptick. Now, this year or was it last year? I guess we had Real Friends, which, this was just the first year I taught it. But Real Friends actually is doing exactly that. I mean, there are fantasy elements in it because, Shannon has a great imagination. And so, she's, but I guess my point is that these texts all basically involve some sort of quest or adventure.
Right.
And even the texts that include some factual information like Egg or Little Tales in the Savannah do it, as you point out, mediated through the comics form and in a fanciful way. And so that's something to just think about too, as a sort of broad survey right now of where editors are in terms of thinking about children's books. If we look at this small sample, there's a lot of reliance upon fantasy and sort of vaulting of the imagination.
Yeah, you're right. And something is lost there too, because I remember some books for early readers, both for ones that I read with my daughter and ones that I encountered as a kid that were about a mother playing with a baby's toes, or, or the interaction of two young kids, absent any kind of, fantasy, or strange world or that kind of thing. And it's conspicuous by its absence. Not that every text has to be like that, but that among 5 that are recognized, and I don't know if this is, trends in publishing. I don't know if this is an aspect of the Eisner judges looking for certain things in this particular category.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, because I think that I must admit, Paul, I feel kind of strange at this particular cultural epoch because, and not for the normal reasons that people are feeling alienated and afraid, but
there's those as well.
There are those as well, but more because I've never really been deeply interested in serial fantasy texts like Star Wars, Star Trek, Star anything, Star fill in the blank, Galaxy anything or whatever.
Star Search? Did you like Star Search?
No, not even that. And I'm thinking about that Galaxy, was it Galaxy Quest with Tim Allen and Alan Rickman? Okay, I liked that movie because it was a parody of movies like that, right? But right now this is just such a heightened time for that. In fact, I would argue that maybe it represents a sort of way of working through issues regarding authoritarian governments, but in a fantasy way, which is fine. Right. I mean, I understand what it's doing, but for the person who really loves nonfiction and who loves realism, this year's list, it's kind of thin on that. And, but I do think a lot of adults, their own reading material and their own viewing material may fall into those categories in a major way. And so there might be a predisposition to look at texts like that. But of course, also, I think that the just looking in the texts that have been available to young readers in general in the children's lit category, it's not that there's a huge absence of realism, but I think that there is this idea that fantasy is the spoonful of sugar.
Yeah.
Even in the form of anthropomorphism, No,
I agree with you. It's also, I think, a bias of maybe comics, because comics do want to take advantage of the visual, and it's sort of like, why have two talking heads wearing regular clothes when you can have two talking heads wearing, awesome costumes, And
it doesn't cost any more to create them, in a sense.
Exactly.
So,
Then, right. In contrast to, say, TV or film or something like that. But I'm with you, actually. I always, as a kid, and even to this day, would rather just see two talking heads in a cafe than two talking heads flying on the back of a dragon. Even if the content of their conversation is the same. And I gotta admit too, I mean, the success of, your Raina Telgemeyers, and even your, I always think of Dave Pilkey now, because he's always on the top of those those charts, as we discussed in a recent episode. I mean, they're Dave Pilkey it's drawing Dog Man, but really, like even your Captain Underpants are basically just kids in underpants,
right.
or Raina's books just kids, and so there's an appeal to kids of realistic stuff. In fact, my daughter, that's her favorite stuff. I mean, she's all up for like a beautiful, flight of fancy or a new world that's being created. But yeah, I think there is something missing when we don't let kids also just sort of enjoy what's mundane and the riches of what's mundane, or the kind of all the intricacies of just a mother-daughter interaction or a mother-son interaction or something like that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the first category. So
we did it.
Let's wipe our brow.
One down, two to go.
One down, two to go. Well, next we are looking at best publication for kids age 9 to 12. And Paul, you're going to start us off with the first entry.
I'm so delighted to talk about this one. You already mentioned it earlier in the episode, but this is one that I had not read until we were starting to look at these books, and I'm so glad. That's my favorite thing about nominations. I'm actually less interested in the winners because it's always really hard for me to understand. It seems like a popularity contest sometimes, right? But it's the lists of various texts that you may or may not have encountered that just, I'm so glad my eyes were open to this one. In this case, we're talking about Bolivar by Sean Rubin, which is from Archaia, which is sort of the graphic novel, subsidiary of Boom. But this is Rubin's first book, and it's kind of a combination of a sort of beginning chapter book. It's divided into chapters, but really comics and illustrated text, because what is sort of a really cute, delightful story about a kid who figures out that he's living next to a dinosaur, and sees this dinosaur all through the city. And she's Sybil is her name. Sorry. Sybil is the young girl. And everywhere she goes, she sees her neighbor, this dinosaur, who is not scary at all, who in fact really enjoys hanging out at a bookstore or a cafe and being unseen and nondescript. And
he reads the New Yorker. Let's be real. I mean,
he reads the New Yorker. That's right. He's a, quintessential city person, basically, just wants to hide among the crowd. And, she meanwhile is chasing him everywhere. So this, really, it's another beautiful illustrated book, but we see scene after scene of New York, and oftentimes we can, in a Where's Waldo kind of way, try to search out where the little glimpse of Bolivar, who is in every single one of these illustrations, even if it's just a tiny little tail or a little shadow of Bolivar, is somewhere, and then we kind of find out what happens as she tries to discover and point out to the world that there's a dinosaur living in the city. And so there's a kind of adventure that comes about through that. But, I found this text absolutely delightful. One of my favorite ones, of a set of, a really great books. What did you think about this one, Gwen?
I loved it. It reminded me a lot of books that I enjoyed as a kid. So I guess we're getting back to this nostalgia, thing, but it reminded me a lot of Harriet the Spy. Harriet walking around the city with her notebook. And it also reminded me in its illustration style of a lot of the work of 1970s and 1980s illustrators, including, I'm thinking of Garth Williams, actually, who is probably best known as the illustrator of Cricket in Times Square or the Laura Ingalls Wilder texts, or those sorts of books. And I love the color. I love the busyness. Again, sort of that same sort of trend of creating this mise en scene that's very populated with interesting details. And I love urban spaces anyway, but the way that there's a lot of drawback scenes where you see a whole bunch of buildings in the distance and then the scene that's happening close to you. And it's that sort of background that really drew me in as well as what was going on in the foreground. So just the city itself becomes a character in its own way. And I thought that was very rich. And I also really liked that. I've always enjoyed that trope of the child sees things that the adults are too busy to notice. There's a wonderful scene early on in the text where Sybil is trying to get her mom to get off of her what looks like a MacBook, right? And I'm laughing because I spend so much of my time. My dog does this to me. He's like, "Will you please get away from those devices and play?" But it's sort of that same thing going on, and it's like her parents just don't get that like she really is seeing something. And I love it when she gives the book report about her neighbor and no one believes her. So it's one of those texts where no one believes Sybil, but she is determined to find the truth. And in a way, it reminded me a lot in that instance of the creepy case files of Margot Malou by Drew Wing. Again, a sort of text that is set in a New York City type environment with a young character who is seeing things that the adults just don't see. And, there the focus is more on monsters, whereas here the focus is on what a absolutely sort of mundane, to use your word from earlier, dinosaur this is. He just wants to blend in. He sees, he likes his corned beef sandwich. He wants to, with a couple pickles on the side, please. And he really just wants to get on with his life. It's really cute.
Yes. Yes, it is. Yeah. Oh, you said so many things that absolutely touched off different thoughts for me about why I like this so much. You're right. The book is about Bolivar and finding this dinosaur, but the dinosaur just wants to live in the city. It says that, as far as Bolivar renting this apartment, the forms said you couldn't have any dogs or cats in the apartment. Bolivar didn't have dogs or cats, so he was allowed to live there.
He was quiet after 10 p.m. and therefore no one complained about him.
Exactly. So it doesn't matter that he's a Tyrannosaurus, but sort of, you're right. Everybody who lives in the city is so caught up. Look, you can see they're listening to their music or staring at their devices or, busy with their tasks. But the illustration, page after page after page, just, screams out. There's wonders to explore around you. You know what I mean? There's, a moment where she's just around what could be Central Park, I guess. And it just reminds me of having gone to Central Park actually just recently, about a month and a half ago, just how your eyes can't even take in everything that's there, whether it's right there in the park and the natural beauty or the horizon with the skyscrapers in the distance. And it's just scene after scene after scene that glories in this. Rubin talks about this book was initially, I think, announced for much earlier than it actually came out. And it took him much longer to draw and to write than he had originally
welcome to my
bargained
world.
For. That's right.
Anybody who's a writer can identify with that one.
Yeah. I think he said something like he was living in the Upper West Side when he started this as a single person, and by the time the book came out, he's already married with 2 children and moved on and stuff like that. But you can see why, because this art must have taken forever to draw. All of the intricate cross-hatching, all of the architecture that's captured, all the liveliness of the city is represented here. And it's just a great quality of this book.
And it has a very Sendakian feel, I would argue, too. Some of the cross-hatching, the shading, the creation of interiors, like the pictures of dinosaur relatives on the wall dressed in like 19th century clothing. That is just Sendak all over. I mean, there's ways, and although I want to say, I think Rubin has done something that's really awesome and very much his own, but you can also sort of see those links there. It just has a really sweet feel to it. This is my a real tie for my favorite book of the year. And like you, I'm really glad because, both Paul and I have been busy this year. It's like an understatement. And we've tried to keep up, but it's been somewhat difficult. This is one we probably really should have reviewed. And I'm glad that we've had a chance to bring it to our listeners' attention now, because it's just, some of these could be screen like savers that you could look at for days, and all of the details, you wouldn't pick them up all at once. You really would have to look at it. There's one instance where we're getting this sort of Broadway and 95th Street, I think, and it's these beautiful lanterns are hanging over the city. There's Chinese signs and and then the sort of skyscrapers in the background, a stoplight, a taxi. There's just so much going on, and the colors are so rich in this comic. Lovely. It's sort of in that way, sort of like Arthur and the Golden Rope, but in this instance, I sort of feel like this is a point where the speech bubbles kind of integrate nicely into the comic, and you don't necessarily notice them. I do like the way that that Bolivar's speech bubbles are sometimes green, which is sort of his color too. And I think that's so, he's kind of speaking slightly dinosaur or whatever. And so it's just, I really loved this book.
Yes. Yeah. It really is hard to overstate how beautiful the book is. I mean, there's places where, he draws a mosaic. In fact, he draws a musician in a subway in front of a mosaic, and the detail, the color, the sort of balance of things. And the characters have this, really Bill Watterson-esque, cartooned quality. That's really also very charming.
And if you're annoyed by public officials, there's a really great scene where the mayor of New York ends up upside down, and you can see that one of his shoes is very worn. I just might want to add, that's the level of detail that we get here, but it's just so amusing.
Worn shoes.
It's just I really love this book. It's a feast for the senses, and it's just a sweet text.
Yeah. And actually, just to tie it to the previous conversation before we move on to our next text, which is interesting in this respect as well, the way that it fuses together, sort of maybe traditional children's book with a more visual, like illustration focused book with comics, it really uses all of those kinds, the hybridity of it. It uses all those at just the right moment for just the right point of the narrative in really clever ways. And, it's really commendable. I think if somebody were asking, how do you see this thing that you were talking about earlier, comics coming together with other kinds of texts that we, types and genres that we generally associate as not comics, I'd hand this to them as an example of all of it being masterfully woven together. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, our next text is very different stylistically, and also feels like it's for perhaps a slightly older reader. It's called Home Time, Under the River, and it's book 1 of what will be a series by Campbell White, and he's an Australian illustrator. This is coming to us out of Top Shelf, which is clearly making more of an investment in young readers' comics. And it's the story of twins, Lily and David, who are just finishing up primary school school and will be starting into secondary school the next year. And this is going to be their summer for home time, where they don't have to be at school. One of the really neat ways that White introduces you to not only Lily and David, but to the entire cast of their friends is by having them give a little speech, which teachers often do at when kids are about to graduate from one school to another, of what they plan to be when they grow up. And so we learn a lot about these characters. Lily wants to be a vet. David wants to be an astronaut. And the other friends, it's interesting. Ben wants to help run his brother's pizzeria. Nathan wants to be a comics creator. Lawrence wants to run a bookstore. And Amanda, who's very wishy-washy, has no idea what she wants to be. And so you learn about the characters early on based on how they approach the future or what they see as a future for themselves. So the book starts off in a very traditional kind of realistic way. It has the feeling of a lot of texts that we've touched upon, where the focus is on friends and their interactions, but then fantasy enters the text, and it enters the text in some really fascinating ways, involving this river that they live by and creatures that come out of that river, and the kids end up getting trapped and want to try to come home. And I will tell you right now that this book ends on something of a cliffhanger.
That's right.
And one other thing that I just want to mention, and then I'll turn it over to you, Paul, is that there's a way that the characters are drawn that's very particularized. Typically, when we look at the way that figures are drawn, most comics creators will fall into either sort of a highly iconic way of drawing a character, or they may borrow from certain traditions so that there's a sense of familiarity when looking at, say, you can definitely notice in children's comics a difference post-Peanuts era, right? Charles Schulz had a profound impact on the way that subsequent comics creators draw children. And in the text that we've looked at up to this point, I mean, now I would be able to recognize the work of Claude Ponti because he has a very particular style, but it's a style that, as we said before, borrows from a lot of other styles. This particular style is really interesting to me because it has most of the pages are drawn with sort of a light yellow background, and the characters look as if they've been drawn with pencil. The characters themselves almost have a look as if they'd come out of a codice, only it's different than a codice. They are drawn as fully dimensional characters, but their faces are very round, almost like I'm thinking of the artist Is it Rodo Boulanger? Graciela Rodo Boulanger. There we go. She was a 1960s and 70s printmaker, and my parents loved her, and so we had her prints all over our house. And she drew children. If you Google her, we'll put it into the show notes. She drew children mainly as her subject, and in a very fascinating kind of way, and with very round faces. And that's sort of what's happening here. It has the feel. At first, I felt it was sort of off-putting, but then once I got used to it, I don't know how to explain it, but there's just something really authentic about it that almost made it feel as if this was a diary being drawn by a teenager, and not because the art level isn't strong, because it is, but there's just something about it that feels intimate and kiddie, almost like Mad Magazine, only from the olden days, only not sexualized. Because let's be real, most of Mad Magazine's drawings were, at least from my era in the 70s. But then there's also all of these artifacts that are dropped into the text. Like at one point, Lily is writing in what looks like either a piece of stylized stationery or a diary page, and the writing looks like the writing of a young kid. And so there's ways in which the verisimilitude that these are actual kids who are going through this actual thing is really underscored. But then there's the fantasy element, and I think it in some ways creates the impression that the fantasy is real, because you have it sort of enveloped in this incredibly realistic sort of mode of delivery that you would more expect to find in a purely realist text.
Yeah. I think you captured it so really quite well. This is, around 225, 230 pages. So the story and every page quite dense, as you were saying. So there's various, twists and turns, especially as they enter the fantasy realm. And part of those twists and turns, are sort of, marked out for us by shifts in artistic style. And so I'm glad that you described what is, I think, probably the anchoring style of this work, in terms of it's the one that introduces us to these characters, and it's how we, get to know these characters and how we start, seeing their interaction and imagining the world that they live in. I'm glad that you had, us probably a wider set of references to use to describe it. I thought initially of, actually not even in this part, but really when they first arrive in the fantasy, world by the river, I thought of the, artist Farrell Dalrymple, the cartoonist Farrell Dalrymple.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, but then we go from there. I mean, then it becomes like Adventure Time, and then another place it becomes pixelated, like a video game, and so Campbell White is definitely playing with different art styles that are obviously have significance within the story, are purposeful within the story, and it's a story that goes in a lot of different places, a lot of different twists and turns. I think some of this, I could be wrong, but I think was maybe serialized on the web. You can go to campbellwhite.com, where you can see White's art. It's spelled CAMPBELLWHYTE. But if you want a glimpse at not only this art style that we're talking about, but the variety that is in the book, you can see some of it there. But I think part of White's concern was that this kind of story of the adolescent experience and the crossing over from one age to another, and how that journey is, experienced by a group and often marked by, the fantasy or adventure. I think that's something that a lot of texts are up to, which White recognizes. One of his concerns, as I've read in a few interviews, is that he's able to show that in the particularities of Australia and specifically Perth, is that how you,
right?
where he comes from, where he hails from. And so there are some parts of this text where I recognize, there's aspects of this, whether it's culture or language or just, locality, that are very much about not just growing up, the universals, but growing up in a particular time and place, even in the fantasy elements, and how those fantasies often weave together your imaginations of indigenous peoples or whatever, or societies that are nearby. All of that is I think particular to White wanting to show growing up here. And so that made it really interesting for me as a text. It's one that I wish I had more time to just study. I read the whole thing, but it was the kind of such a arduous journey of various twists and turns. Not to say that this was a hard read. It was a delightful read, but just that it went in so many different places. I was like, I need more time with this, to really kind of appreciate what it's doing.
Well, I'm laughing now because while we were talking, I was thinking about what image I might use in the show notes for Graciela Roda Boulanger. And guess what? She's a Bolivian painter. And I probably knew that at some time. And the last text we talked about was Bolivar.
Sure.
Do. I sometimes wonder, because there are other examples I could have given of this, but it's like, sure. I wonder if that's why. So there we go. We've also plumbed the very shallows of my mind to get our references today. But actually, I agree with you, Paul. I think that this is a text with, if you wanted to sort of understand what it might be like to be an Australian teenager or maybe preteen, this text does a good job of that. I think it really does have that feel, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was interesting, and as you say, it's a fascinating experience to read all of these in a category together, because to me, I saw some correspondences between Sybil's experiences with her classmates in Bolivar and some of the classmate experiences in Home Time as well. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah. It's a great artifact for like an art student to study, just in terms of the raw variety of
a form, really.
Exactly. I think that brings us to our next text, which we're excited to talk about. Again, we were certainly excited to talk about it the first time. This is Nightlights by Lorena Alvarez from Nobrow. We previously talked about Nightlights, and so we'll link to our past conversation. For me, it was one of my favorite comics period of last year. And so I've been super excited about its success, and it's a book that has really stuck with me, that I've sort of thought about again and again. And also we could mention that Alvarez was also nominated in one of the art categories for the Eisner Awards. So deservingly so, because the art is stunning in this book. But I'm excited to revisit Nightlights with you, Gwen. Do you want to share some thoughts about this text now that we get to talk about it again?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I had mentioned about the text when we first discussed it was actually the color, the use of color. That Alvarez is a colorist as well as a comics creator, and it's just an absolutely stunning text. It's also an interesting story in that it's about a young girl who's trying to discover what her talents are and what the limits of those talents are and what she's willing to give up in order to express them. It's also, I think, a story about fear and anxiety, and the way that can manifest itself in some really complicated ways. And this is one of those books where we talked about it last year, but it stuck with me, and I've continued to go back and to think about it and to relate it to other texts. So in that respect, it's really a memorable text for sure.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Coming into this conversation, it really is, as I said, really one of the comics of last year that I just couldn't shake, and because it has stuck with me. I think and trying to think about why it did stick with me so much. Yes, the visuals, just totally takes your breath away. The color, the balance, the compositions are amazing. There's aspects of it that really draw this, school life in a very cool way, that give them an atmosphere and a mood that, sometimes it's playful, but oftentimes it's very dark and scary, but not in a sort of like cheap, scary way, if you could say that. And then there's parts where it's just, her imagination or like weird ghost things and fantasy creatures and stuff like that are also stunning in their own way. So, so it's the visuals, but it's also, you were saying before, it's like this incredible expression of the anxieties you have as a kid and the trade-offs you have to make between your own sort of like your own mind, your world, and the social world, and so the scary ghost in this story comes to kind of represent friendship. And when you think about life as a child, there's so many things that are like, this is me drawing in my living room floor, and this is like the world that I'm creating and the understanding that I'm making. And then suddenly you find that you have to, like you said, in some ways, like give that up to make sense of things with other kids. And sometimes that's a frightening prospect. Sometimes it costs us more than we should give up. And I think this text wrestles with that. And I think that's part of why it's also stuck with me so much. Right.
I agree. It's one of those books where I was not at all surprised to see it on this list. And, I would definitely have our listeners, we'll link up to the show where we discuss this because, to me, this text is really held up over time. I'm going to teach it. It's funny. I'm in a really weird place where I won't be teaching any children's lit or comics until probably January 2019. And it's sort of a sad feeling that I couldn't pull my book list together because, there's enough, but Nightlights would be on it because I really would like to get my own students' reaction to it and maybe teach it in tandem with Vera Broskel's Anya's Ghost, where I think a lot of these same ideas are being dealt with, and especially about the way that young women in particular deal with stress and anxiety, and the imaginative sort of realm that sometimes takes them through. So that was a lot of fun. Well, our next book, The Tea Dragon Society, is It's by Katie O'Neill, who's probably known to some of our listeners as the creator of the Princess books, which were very groundbreaking in terms of both their depiction of LGBTQ characters, but also of a depiction of a very diverse cast of characters. And that same sort of diversity comes to play in the Tea Dragon Society, which is the story of Greta, who is a blacksmith apprentice in this sort of ye olde setting, indeterminate ye olde setting. And she lives in a place where dragons grow these leaves, and it's an art, in a way, even a craft, to learn how to brew tea from these dragon leaves. And Greta, the story sort of gets rolling when Greta encounters an injured dragon and takes it to its owner, and that's really where she decides to apprentice to learn this type of knowledge. One of the things that's visually interesting about the text is that it takes place during 4 seasons, and so you have that demarcation of time, and it's the sort of these very clear line drawings with very colorful characters. And it's one of these, this is a fantasy story, but it's not one of those kind of fantasy stories that we've been talking about where there's some huge quest that changes the character forever. This is more of a sort of thoughtful, discourse-based situation where Greta meets a lot of people along the way, including my favorite character, I think, Minette, who is a seer who has lost her memory. And it's really their interactions and appreciation of artistry. So it's really a very, very adorable book, and I very much liked it. What were your thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I was immediately taken with actually the color palette, you know, unlike some of the other ones where we've talked about the color, you know, it was a combination of the choices and rendering. The colors are fairly flat in this book, but it's the particular palette and combination of colors that O'Neill has an eye for that just really makes this book visually pop. The second thing was sort of like, you're right, you know, we have blacksmiths, we have dragons, but there's really no need for any crazy violence. It's really just, it's actually more the setup of their relationships that are fostered by this idea of raising these dragons and tea. I'm also a tea junkie, so there was a
you
part
have
of this
tea by
text
you right now.
If I wasn't talking, I would be drinking tea actually
See,
this very second. So I love that about it. And each of the creatures, in a sort of Pokemon-like way, has, you know, a certain tea that they're associated with or growing or whatever. But indeed, the sort of like almost quiet but really, really sweet sense of romance in the text, and, you know, queer romance in particular, you know, and in a way that makes it like beautiful, you know, that I thought was very, very like I don't want to say groundbreaking. That's the wrong word. I think it felt like a text where this is where we should be. You know, we should be seeing this text and more text like it in that regard.
And I just think Katie O'Neill does it really, really well, because it's not like not like someone comes out with a trumpet and blares it.
Yeah,
you know,
that's
and
right.
that has happened, and you know, it actually shows you the way that the depiction of queer characters in children's literature in general, and comics in particular, I think because of representational issues, the way that is really beginning to evolve. And it's no longer the major aspect of a text necessarily. It's just there. And that's how I felt about this text. That's what I meant when I said it was sort of very relational, and I really, the quest is more just people getting to know each other and understanding each other. And it's really, as you say, very sweet.
Yeah. I love it. And there's this collection has pages in the back that it's the sort of the Tea Dragon handbook, and you learn how tea dragons work. And again, in kind of a Pokemon way, you learn about the Jasmine Tea Dragon and the Rooibos Tea Dragon. I'm enjoying my chamomile Tea Dragon at this very moment.
I want Bolivar as a neighbor, and I want my own Tea Dragon. I want my Scottish Terrier to like drop tea bags, but I don't think that's going to happen. He would shake them to the ground and stomp on them. So I'm afraid that would not work. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm with you. I like this a lot. Yeah. Well, that brings us to the last the last work in this category, the best publication for kids ages 9 to 12. And again, this is another one where I didn't know about it, and I'm really glad that I've now been introduced. This is Wallace the Brave, which is by Will Henry, or Will Henry Wilson, but I think goes by Will Henry, published by Andrews McMeel. And it's actually a collection, the first collection of a webcomic, that is very much in the sort of traditional comic strip type of format, and sort of the four panel, but laid out in a way that works for the web. Readers of say for instance Phoebe and her Unicorn will be interested in this kind of format where the bygone days of newspaper comic strips are revived because web comics can kind of afford that, and Go Comics, which is sort of a site that collects, you can get old Calvin and Hobbes reprints there, as well as some of the new kinds of versions of this kind of stuff. But Wallace the Brave is about Wallace, a kid, and his really charming family, his parents and his funny friends, and they live in a seaside kind of fisherman town called Snug Harbor. And they, sort of daily gag hijinks and hilarity of these kids, and it's a lot of fun. So I didn't know about Wallace until this book, and now I've added it right to the top of my Go Comics daily, page of comics that my daughter and I sometimes read together, to catch up on some old Peanuts, and also to read, Phoebe and her Unicorn and this. And so it was a lot of fun. What did you think? Did you enjoy Wallace the Brave?
I did. I must admit that this isn't a type of comic that I read a lot on my own, but I did. Mm-hmm. I agree with you in everything you've said. There are some really funny parts, though. Just a couple that stuck out to me. One is when he's riding with his mom, and they're in the car, and he says, "Mom, I've never seen this button before." And she says, "Me neither, push it." And in his imagination, the car seat goes ripping out of this panel on the top of their very boring suburban car, like he's some sort of James Bond person. But then we come back down to earth, and the end of the gag is nothing, the mom says, and he says, "It was a Junior Mint stuck to the dashboard." And so this is really, it's sort of that inversion of he imagines this as being really exciting, but it's just an old Junior Mint. And then there's another one where he goes up to his mom who's working in the garden, and he says, "Can we get a llama?" And the mom says, "A llama." Now, Paul, that next to Scooby-Doo, llamas are my thing, right? I mean, I love llamas, right? Yep. And so there's this, the imagination that he has, that Wallace has, is of this wonderful scene where he's riding through town on this llama, and the teacher looks at him with all the school children around her and says, "Epic." And he says, "I can picture myself heroically riding a llama to school in front of a grandiose sunrise," which is exactly what it is. And then the mom says, "Who's going to feed and take care of it?" And he says, "See, I don't picture any of that stuff." And so this I wanted to mention that one specifically because it's one of these comics that reminds me a lot of Calvin and Hobbes, because you get, if you're a parent and you're reading it, you get the sort of, there's a nod towards parents. If you get your kid a pet, you are going to be the person who's primarily taking care of that pet. Unless you have a child who really wants to be a veterinarian, right? It's going to be you. And so that's playing on it, but also just, Calvin would have this incredible imagination of these grandiose things happening. And to me, this comic in a way is a nod to Calvin and Hobbes, and as you said, to Peanuts even, and to some of the earlier comic strip greats. And I did enjoy it. I will say that the other texts in the category had a more narrative feel, a more cohesive narrative feel. So this text felt a little bit different to me, but in some ways it shows you the diversity of comics, and types of comics that are now being produced for young readers. So I actually really enjoyed it.
Yeah. It made me think that, a lot of kids are reading this kind of stuff. I mentioned Phoebe already, but, Phoebe's doing great at the Scholastic book sales and things like that. And we don't talk about it because of that. It's sort of daily serial nature. But even Phoebe, for instance, recently came out with a one-story volume that was just sort of one extended story. And there's, just like with newspaper strips in the past, some continuity. It's a daily gag thing for sure, and you never know, the next day might just have nothing to do with the previous day. But then there's other stories that stretch across a few days, or a few strips. one where he finds a snake in the where they find a snake in the bathroom, and Wallace has to go take care of it, and so he doesn't know what to do, and he's walking around the halls, as we all have experienced, like when you're not supposed to be in the halls, but in this case he's holding a snake, and so he decides to put it in his locker. He slips it through the crack in the locker, and then he goes, "Wait, this isn't my locker." There were so many times when I was reading this book when I thought I wanted to mark it and say, "Oh, read that one" during the episode, but then there just became too many of them. But to reflect back on something that we were saying, I think Calvin and Hobbes made one of the most like boss moves in comics history to really go out while it was on top.
Right.
And, it was a 10-year run. It was magical. I think my generation, for sure grew up with, Calvin sort of having reshaped comics the way that Harry Potter reshapes, fiction for kids. And I think we've all been, sort of like, it's like after Michael Jordan, everything is compared to Michael Jordan. After Calvin and Hobbes, there's this hole left, this vacuum left that, we always, unfortunately, for better or for worse, compare everything from Foxtrot to, to something like this to it. But I think we're all sort of like have that hunger for something that's going to meet that appetite. And so, I think that this is the kind of text, and Henry has sort of explicitly mentioned that in a few of his interviews, that reference, and also referencing the comic strip Cul-de-sac,
right,
which sort of art style wise has some similarities, affinities here too. But if those are things that are appealing to listeners, I mean, this is one that you definitely should check out. Ongoing Adventures of Wallace the Brave, as well as this first collection, which is just entitled Wallace the Brave. It's very likable. I'm also a big fan of not just Wallace, but his pal Spud,
right,
who is hilarious, and also the very tough friend Amelia, the new girl in town, who, the one thing about reading Calvin with my daughter, for instance, is that it's very 1985 or 1995 in terms of like gender,
right,
and kids.
Right.
And this one flips a lot of that.
Oh yeah, I mean, the first time you meet Amelia, she's about to hit a wasp nest with a rock, and they're bringing this like desiccated muffin that someone had left in the schoolroom over the summer, and she says, "Oh, this is even better," and she whaps that hornet's nest, and it's really fun, of course, with predictable results, but. Amelia rocks. She is not a shrinking violet, and she is a lot of fun. So this is a nice way, I think, to end this category. It's really a rich category. It's my favorite age range to teach, in terms of teaching comics and teaching children's lit. And there's a lot on offer there. All right.
Yeah. And just to, again, Bolivar, Home Time, Nightlights, Tea Dragon Society, Wallace the Brave. Just want to echo what you just said, Gwen. This, out of the 3 age range categories, and really trying to judge each on its own merits and rubrics. This was my favorite of this year.
Me too.
These 5 books.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so our final category is Best Publication for Teens, age 13 to 17, and we're going to start off with a text that you and I reviewed, Paul, earlier this year, The Dam Keeper. It was originally a 2014 animated short film directed by a Pixar alum group of Robert Kondo and Dice Tsutsumi, and it tells the story of sort of an introverted little pig who lives in this town that has been basically a fortress for the people who live in it from the darkness that apparently exists in the forest beyond. And the comic book employs much of the same visual artistry that was in the original 2014 textbook. I'm tired. The 2014 short film. But in this particular instance, we because of the comics medium, I think itself, and the way that things are slowed down, and I think you get a little bit more character development, a little bit more time is spent not only on Pig's relationship with his late father, who basically gives Pig this assignment of being the person who protects the town by making sure that the ramparts are strong. It's also sort of a story about his complicated relationship with his school friends, including a new friend who's come to town named Fox. And one of the things that I think we mentioned in our review, which we'll link to here, is I at least found it to be one of those texts where I think you would really benefit from being not only someone who spent a lot of time sort of watching anime and also sort of playing video games, that it also is helpful to understand that like a lot of the things that we take for granted when a film is unfolding in front of us, we have to put together when we're looking at the same artifact rendered as a comic. And so this is one of those texts that for me took a lot of work to stay grounded in where I was in the narrative. But for the most part, it was a visually stunning book. Again, one of those texts that has stayed with me over the last 5 or 6 months since we did our review.
Yeah, you're right. And we talked about this in our original conversation about how some of the language or the grammars of, animation and video games, more familiar maybe to some of the kids who are the target readers than to you and to me. And so it's, it does take a little bit of getting used to for readers like us who have spent
we do better with nostalgia, right? It's like
That's right. But that shouldn't take away from its merits. And it's a 3-book series, and the second book is to come out in July. And so I think that again, just this book is breathtaking to look at, to the beauty of the art. And I'm excited actually now to read the second book. I think you and I both felt like the story was just getting going when it ended, and we were sort of hungry for the bigger story and where it would take us. And so I'm excited to see this go to the next place. And I gotta admit, I was surprised it wound up on this list. Not because it lacked merit, but because I felt like it was just getting going. And if you were going to reward this kind of storytelling, that this might have been a good spot to reward Faith Erin Hicks's work, which is more fully realized at this point. You know what I mean? Like I almost want to reward or nominate the second or the third book of a trilogy, which has already established that it's doing its thing, than something that is still in the process of showing us its stuff. And that's how I felt a little bit about Dam Keeper. But I don't mean to damn it with my my critiques. I think it really is a beautiful book to look at.
No, I'm going to second you on that. I was surprised. I was surprised also because, frankly, I think that the YA category right now is one that publishers are spending a lot of time focusing on. If you look at the catalogs and at the solicitations, there's just such a focus on that market right now. So maybe also what we're feeling is there were a lot of texts that I'm surprised weren't represented. And of course, there can only be 5. But I also kind of quibble with the fact that in some ways I might have put this text up into the best publication for kids, 9 to 12. And so there's also sort of a designation. This doesn't have quite the same feel as some of the other entrants in this. Although I would argue as well that Lewis Undercover, which we're going to talk about in a minute, by Fanny Britt and Isabel Arsenault, I probably would have put in kids 9 to 12 as well. So I think here we're really getting into that situation of who is the intended audience for these texts? Does a protagonist? I mean, the protagonist in Dam Keeper is a pig who appears to be in middle school. At least in the beginning of the text. And Lewis Undercover is definitely in upper elementary, early middle school type range. So seeing those next to other texts in the category like Jane and Monstrous was really surprising in some ways. So this is one of those categories where, just sort of like with the early reader, maybe it's because we're bookending either end of the young reader spectrum, but I was sort of surprised to see a couple of these titles here, and not again to denigrate the quality of the work, which is excellent, just to say that it would be interesting if the judges published a rationale in some ways for these categories, and if there was more discussion about what we mean by these categories. I think that would be really helpful to those lowly reviewers such as ourselves who read a lot of books and then are like, oh, okay, well.
Yeah. Well, hey, I want to take this opportunity, something I've been wanting to say. If anybody is listening out there from the Eisners, can I nominate Gwen as one of a prospective judge? I know it's a tall task, but she is more than qualified.
Go to Paul. That's so sweet. But no, really, if I were, I would say, all right, let's talk about what we really. I'm sure that they do. I'm sure they have these conversations. Yeah. But sure, these are important awards. They truly do sometimes represent the only texts that people without children and without a sort of strong professional interest in children's and YA comics will read, will interact with. And so, this is one of those times when it would be helpful, I think, to have a slight more detail. Now, to be fair, American Library Association has been doing awarding for, nearly a century now. And for that reason, the categories and the prizes there have a great deal of description attached to them. If something wins the Caldecott, you can go and find a 2-page single-space set of criteria and discussion. You know that well yourself because of the work you've done. And for these, it's just here they are. And it would be sort of fun to have a little bit more detail. But I guess we should move on. But The Dam Keeper, again, I agree with you. I'm looking forward to the next 2 volumes. And I guess I should have said at the beginning that this is a first-second text. So we know it's been well curated. And so that is exciting. So. Yeah. First, second, and Tonko House, which is the Kondo and Tsutsumi sort of outfit there. Yeah. Well, this next text comes to us from Boom Archaia, once again. And this one is Jane, written by Aline Brosh McKenna and drawn by Ramon Perez. Jane is a modern adaptation of Jane Eyre. And so therefore it's about a young artist who is recruited to take care, to become essentially a nanny for, a little girl, and in a situation that it seems that no other nannies can survive. And it turns out it's not the girl herself. Isabel is charming and wonderful, but because, it's in a mysterious sort of mansion that, where the, brooding and mysterious, father and sort of owner is this intimidating figure. But like I said, it's a modern adaptation, so it happens in the big city. Do they name the city that this is meant to take place in? I think you just are meant to think it's New York. Yeah, I think they do actually, definitely. Because she comes from the East Coast, and I think you get that sense.
Sure.
But anyway, that's what I thought anyway. So yeah.
Got it. Yeah. It makes, I should know better, but I don't. But, no, it's got lots of contemporary intrigue mixed in with this, now classic tale. McKenna is a screenwriter who's done films like, the adaptation of The Devil Wears Prada and Annie, and also TV shows like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, and, Ramon Perez is an artist who's known for his adaptation of Tale of Sand, as well as work on comics like Hawkeye and stuff like that, who really combines different media in a really cool way. Some pages that look like pencil, and others that employ watercolors, and others that mix them together, and stuff like that. So, I don't know. Do you like Jane Eyre? Did this story read to you, does it work in 2018? Gwen, I'm curious what your thoughts were about this.
I like Jane Eyre? Oh, that's so cute. Okay, so, I'm a white lady who's 54. Yes, I really like Jane Eyre. My childhood was spent reading all of the Brontes and Austen and whatever. Okay, but that said, I'm also a scholar of children's and YA lit. And I have to admit that when we saw this comic on our list, I hadn't read it yet. And what was interesting to me is I thought originally it was an adaptation of a contemporary novel written in 2011 by April Lindner called Jane. And I'm going to read you the blurb on that. Forced to drop out of an esteemed East Coast college after the sudden death of her parents, Jane Moore takes a nanny job at Thornfield Park, the estate of Nico Rathburn, a world-famous rock star on the brink of a huge comeback. Okay, so I was already, and I had actually read that when it came out and thought it was a pretty good novel. I've never taught it, but I thought it was an interesting adaptation. It really was exploring how do you bring a text that was so clearly grounded in the gender dynamics and in the class dynamics of the 19th century and bring that forward into the 20th century or the 21st century. So, you know, that's that. So when I first picked it up, I thought, oh, cool, they've made a graphic novel of this novel. No, this is an entirely separate adaptation. Sure. And it seems very timely in a way because in this particular adaptation, Mr. Rochester is this sort of, you know, captain of industry type guy. And so it has, it's when you consider that, like, if you actually can stomach the news, almost every news story in the last couple months has come out of the sort of interesting financier class of New York City and all of their wacky doings that are now getting them brought up on indictments. It seemed kind of an interesting choice. Well, this text is, I think, in some ways, goes in a different direction than the YA novel adaptation from a few years back, in that it really does, on the one hand, try to stay with the characters, their names, things that happen to them. But in some of the same sort of storylines are there. But in this particular instance, I think that there's a really nice tension that develops between Jane's trying to find her voice as an artist and also trying to sort of negotiate a world that's very unfamiliar to her. And in that respect, I think it does capture some of the original origin texts, sort of creation of a character who struggles a great deal to find her voice. But in this particular instance, sort of some of the choices with, and I don't really want to give too much away because I think that what makes this adaptation interesting is some of the ways that it plays with what is known in literary studies as the mad woman in the attic, right? And Bertha Mason. And so I think that I'd sort of like to not talk too much about that because I would not want to spoil it for readers. I will say that initially I felt like the choice to colorize Jane and keep everything else sort of in a monochrome tone was a little odd. I felt like she was drawn to me in a way that seemed discordant with the story. It reminded me a lot of those soap opera comics from my childhood that I never read but were always there. Like I'm thinking of Modesty Blaze, and there's another one too. I can't remember the name of right away, but I never really read them because in part I felt like the way that women were being depicted was very 40s, 50s. And there's something about the way that Jane is drawn in this particular comic that initially was a little off-putting to me. It felt almost like a Lichtensteinian kind of, drawing of her, or a Warhol kind of drawing. And when everything else was really monochromatic and sort of very focused on line, right? And then you've got this very colorful orange kind of character initially. But once I got used to that, and there were only a couple of times when it felt sort of discordant to me, I felt that the tone, for the most part, the tone of the text and the storyline and the illustrations did come together for me as I moved through the text. I will say that I actually maybe liked the YA adaptation from 2011 a little bit more in terms of storyline, but of course it wasn't a comic. I think that for a generation of young people who've heard of Jane Eyre and maybe have been assigned it, this might be an interesting entree into it. There's enough of a correspondence there that I think it's absolutely manageable. But I would say, I enjoyed it. And I thought that I could see how some young person who felt like they were in a difficult situation at home or that no one understood them, it does kind of give you a very good recipe for how to go to the big city and sort of suck it up and crawl your way to the top, if you will, to finding your voice and finding your vocation. And so in that respect, it also felt very much like a YA text. It made sense to me to be in this category, and I could definitely see myself teaching it.
Yeah. It does feel like a YA text, definitely. And I think with that came, for me, some parts about it I absolutely loved, and some parts that I still remain troubled by, or I'm still questioning.
Let's talk about those. You notice me, I've been very measured, so now I want to hear what you have to say.
Right. Well, first to say, I think that Ramon Perez is a phenomenal artist, but does take some getting used to, like you said. And this was true of Tale of Sand, and this was true. I really enjoyed his work on Hawkeye, for instance, but it was a little jarring because the way that he mixes, sort of things that might appear unfinished, but I think it's very purposeful, in the sense that something is more penciled, or something
like
is more,
buildings just flipping disappear. Come on, let's be real.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's part of a different an intention to communicate different levels of completeness, or I think sometimes there's a dreamlike feeling that or something that is more like memory, or something that is more fading when you sort of remove all of the polish of colors and maybe finished line work and stuff like that. So it's all purposefully put to use, but I do think so the art is really cool. I think that the way that Perez captures mood with color, the way that buildings and fashion, all that sort of stuff are put to use. I think two things I think that I wondered about, or that bothered me. One is that the strength of Bronte and Austen and so forth is how much it captured interiority in a way that was not previously seen in literature. And this is a struggle for comics, which is a visual medium where you don't want to overbog text with narration. But it seemed that some of the art was meant to give us a degree of what's going on in Jane's experience in her head, seeing things from her perspective. But that's hard to do when we see Jane so much. And I think this is one of the quandaries of comics adaptation, is that when we read prose, we get so much of what's in characters' heads. When we see them in comics, it's so much of what their eyes look like, or what their hands are doing, or what the hair is doing. And so the sort of subject-object position, sorry, I'm getting super theoretical now, but the sort of subject-object position, we just don't get as much of like, this is what she's thinking about. And that was so much of the richness of Jane Eyre for me. Even parts where we're blocked from what she was thinking, and we only see what she's doing, those tales of manners and things like that were just such a rich and complex world that we get some translation of here, but not quite the same. So that was one thing. The other thing was, it still remains a young woman who is in this house employed by a rich guy who she sort of falls in love with, and he's a jerk, like he's a mean jerk. And that, of course, is something that, Pride and Prejudice. So, it's like a aspect of the genre. I get that. But there's also, I think this is the part where it's 2018. And, like you said, there's these things in the headlines. There's also other things in the headlines that just make me think about the way that this masculinity plays right now. And especially as it becomes something that we put in front of teenagers. And, I don't know. I guess some of my questions come around that.
And I would simply say that was one of the reasons I preferred the 2011 adaptation, because the character who is, the guy is going to be jerky. It's part of the origin text, but there are there are different levels of that, and certain things that I found kind of surprising, I guess I would say. And again, I think you're supposed to believe at the end when she has, I'm just going to say it. She becomes more of an accomplished artist. You get the sense that she's standing on her own, but there's always the sort of very understandable #MeToo feeling that you have in reading a text that, to be fair, the origin text is now quite old, and we're still fighting these same issues. It's interesting. Maybe this is a good transition into Lewis Undercover, because it's our next text. And I think that this is a text where it's just the opposite. Interiority is something that is done very well in this text. So maybe we can think about that as a comparison. The text is called Louis Undercover. It's by Fanny Britt and Isabelle Arsenault. It's translated by Christelle Morelli and Susan Oriou. This is out of the wonderful Canadian imprint Groundwood Books, House of Anansi. And
Anansi,
yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
And I had a lot going on there with all the French. I was like, can I get all that out?
Sure. That's a tough one.
But this is an amazing book. It is my favorite book of the year, maybe one of my favorite books I've ever read. I loved it that much. And I don't even really know where to begin because I don't want to gush, but I'm really close on that. So you've given me an entryway, which is to say that this is a text that follows the experiences of a young man who is living with his mother and his younger brother, who humorously is called Truffle by his family. And his little brother is Truffle. And they're living in an apartment in Montreal that's right on a major 6 or 12 lane freeway. And they had previously lived in the countryside with as a family unit. Unfortunately, the father is dealing with alcoholism, and it has caused the family to split up. And it's really a story of how this young man both observes and learns from his parents' relationship and his father's struggles, but it's also about him gathering up the courage to speak to a young woman whom he has a crush on. And it's also really his attempt to learn that love does not always have to follow the same pattern that it has followed for your parents. He has this realization that love is both this wonderful feeling, but it also is this perilous feeling because there's always the possibility that it will fracture, that you can still love someone, but their behavior, for instance, makes it impossible for you to live with them. And this is a story that is in multiple chapters. Each chapter is a vignette in the sort of progression both of his father's disease and of the sort of way that the family is configured. And it is beautifully rendered. The coloring is incredible. And if you're looking for a comic that achieves what Paul was talking about, that interesting ability to show the inner thinking and observations of a protagonist, this text does it both through figural placement, through, color, through point of view. It's truly an exceptional book. And it's a book that presents, I think, adult conflict and adult struggle with what is a very debilitating disease. Addiction is really a traumatic thing for the person experiencing it and for the people who are observing that person. This book handles this so sensitively and so thoughtfully that it doesn't in any way sensationalize the father's conflicts. And I thought it was just a stunning, stunning book.
Yeah. This book, for me too, remains the discovery of this round of reading nominations. Every page is a web of visual metaphors and symbolism that is both thought-provoking as art and also completely heartbreaking or heart-wrenching, beautiful in how much it sort of shows what you either imagine or all too intimately that feels like to be in that to be in Louis's situation, to observe a father he loves falling apart at the seams, to think about his mother. And you're absolutely right. There's a way that, rather than trying to match the interiority of prose, it actually shows how art can convey interiority in it all in its own way.
And in a book that really deals with what it means to be a man. Right. Louis is very nurturing. He comes upon an injured raccoon and he nurtures it back to health. He is very observant of his mother and what he feels that she is going through and the pain that she's feeling, even though he doesn't fully understand it. And it does provide, and, he's worried himself that this young woman he likes won't notice him or won't care about him. And in a way, his behavior towards others is such that we get the sense that she has been observing him and that she does see the kind of person that he is. It's truly a powerful book, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved this book. And it is a revelation for me. I think it's, one of my favorites, and I'm sad that I missed it until now, but I'm glad that this has been rectified. And it's worth noting that it's also been nominated, from the Eisners for Best, Penciler Inker for Arsenault's art.
Which I totally
as well
get.
As for Best
that is totally deserved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I love that. And also interestingly for best lettering, because, it's sort of hand lettered throughout and, with choices throughout that again are perfect for depicting that, experience through the perspective, the mind of the child, of watching this thing about which Lewis must feel all kinds of feelings, and all of those so, conveyed with, a lot of what I appreciate about the book is its minimalism. We've talked about a lot of artists today who have a splashiness with their color palettes, or with their rendering. This is very artfully chosen stuff, where there's actually, there are a lot of marks made, but they're not necessarily, fussy marks. They're actually really, they're very kind of high art in the way that they're.
No, I agree, and I don't think you don't even have to be ashamed of that. I think in many ways this book feels very much like a French comic. It's not surprising that it comes out of that it's set in Montreal, that it was originally in French. It has the artistry, the high artistry that one comes to expect from, say, typically Belgian or French comics. I was just blown away by this comic. I actually want to get it in the original as well. So yeah,
Do you read French?
I do read French.
Okay,
I speak it horribly.
awesome.
In fact, yesterday or a couple of days ago, I ran into someone who's a French speaker, and we were speaking, and my ability to respond was curtailed pretty quickly. But I do enjoy reading French, and I like looking at comics in their original language simply because there are certain things like placement and a subtle word choice that sometimes can't be conveyed, although this seems to be a very beautiful translation. So that's not in any way a criticism of the translators. I'm just saying that it's a lot of fun sometimes to see the comics in their original form. So.
Totally. Yeah. And Gwen, I agree with you when you said earlier that this could be a book that a 11-year-old could really, the super wise 11-year-old could really appreciate, as well as, the teens that it's categorized for. But let me just say, like, as a father reading this book, and heartbreakingly recognizing aspects of myself. I don't have a problem with alcohol, but certainly my own sets of addictions and things like that. But more just recognizing the mercurial nature and what it must do to a child. It's heartbreaking in that sense. And so I like, many of these books we would probably both say, don't limit yourself and don't think that if you're an adult, this isn't for you. This one, I emphatically just have to convey that, because it is, I think it's landmark, not just as a young reader comic, just as a comic.
Yeah, it's a very powerful comic. And it's interesting because I think the Isabelle Arsenault is known as a illustrator of children's books, apparently in France and probably in Francophone Canada. And I want to now know more about her work as well, because the way that, as you say, it's just such beautiful stylized drawing. And, you think about what the storyboard looked like and what Britt was trying to convey with it. And then what Arsenault does is just pretty profound. So, I hope that they continue to work together, actually, because this is just really a stunning comic. And, and it, it may not have gotten as much play as a couple of the other ones on this list. And, as we'll see, because the last two on this list have been very popular. But I'm going to say that regardless of whether it wins, it is a winner in my book, and I really strongly recommend it.
Yeah, me too. I'm definitely going to chase down Jane the Fox and Me, which is a collaboration of this same team, writer, artist, as well as translators. But yeah, definitely, this is a high recommendation from us. But you alluded to it, and that takes us to really our last two texts in this category and for our list here. And first, we're going to look at Monstrous. Monstrous is maybe I think I could be mistaken, but I think it's actually the most nominated single comic of the Eisners this year. Yep. It's the second sort of, I guess we can talk about the first and second volume. Volume 1 was nominated last year, and we talked about it on last year's Eisner's episode. Gwen, you and I did it for young readers. It's also been nominated for Best Writer for Marjorie Liu, Best Painter and Cover Artist for Sana Takeda, and Best Continuing Series. And so it remains into its second volume and the third to be collected soon. A stunning achievement of monthly comics. It's sort of almost bigger than monthly. It seems amazing that this is serialized monthly comics, but what it does that makes it sort of worthy of the best of monthly comics is it's kind of popular storytelling that's also a very powerful counter narrative about, women and colonialism and agency and worlds of political intrigue and kind of this deep mythology, these mysteries that are still being unpacked. And so we can link to last year's episode if you want to listen to another super long rundown of a bunch of great comics that you and I had. That was a total treat and a pleasure. But, Monstrous remains astounding, an achievement, and I consider it one of my favorite comics that I actually do pick up every month. It's stayed on my pull list, and I've actually tried to talk about Monstrous several times here and on my own podcast called Comic Syllabus, but I just can't. It seems so huge that I keep trying to study it, and the meager time that I can devote to it doesn't ever seem enough. I remember, Gwen, that you had some mixed feelings about it. Did you get a chance to take another look at Monstrous? And I wonder what your thoughts are.
I did, and I still feel the same. But I think that our listeners have to understand that this is just not a genre of fiction that I enjoy. But that said, I do want to talk for a minute about the profoundly amazing quality, consistent quality of this comic over a long period of time. I mean, we know that when someone sets out to write a graphic novel, it can sometimes take 5 to 10 years. It's not always, but truly, it's usually quite an investment. And while there's pressure for a comics creator to make sure that they're meeting their deadlines with their publishers for a graphic novel, this text is, that in its collected form, if it were being written as just a collected graphic novel and you picked it up, you might assume it took years to do. The fact that they are consistently carrying on this storyline and carrying on this high level of visual sort of mastery, really, it's unbelievable to look at. So just disregard the fact that I don't particularly like this kind of text. I want to say that I totally understand why it's on this list. I think that many of the ideas, especially I think if you want to be specific, the heroine is someone who is trying to contend with the past and with the death of her mother and with what that means for her in the world now. And that is to me a very universal kind of feeling that I think people have, especially younger people, when they lose a parent and are in some ways still living out some of the effects of that parent's life and that parent's choices and trying to figure out who they are. That comes across in this comic in a really powerful way. And so I absolutely understand why it is on this list. And again, I'm just amazed at the level, the incredible quality for a text that obviously is being created on a deadline, and in a collaborative sense. It's just really amazing.
It is amazing. It is amazing month after month that Sana Takeda makes this comic. I think they take a few breaks as Image series. I forgot to mention this is coming out from Image Comics, but they take a few breaks as Image series tend to do. But but the consistency, the quality, it is amazing. It's breathtaking. Sana Takeda must have assistants.
Yeah, because this isn't the only series too. I think that Takeda's working on. I don't know.
Oh, is that right?
I think that she's doing. I think that they're doing other work too. So I guess my point is that wow. I wish I had that level of energy and dedication because I'm trying to think now of what else it is I think that Takeda's doing. Why do I think that that Takeda's doing something else?
Yeah. Well, it's possible because, I think especially Japanese artists and anime, studios have gotten down to a fine craft, which doesn't mean that it doesn't require hours and hours and hours of dedicated work. It's just that they've figured out how to distribute that work. But, again, sometimes you read really popular manga or well-done manga, and there's a few pages of color that just are stunning hint, and then it gets to black and white, and it's still a lot of labor behind that. But to have page after page after page of this really robust work that includes monsters, includes costume, includes architecture and design, just the design work in the background of this stuff, not to mention, panel after panel of rendering action in such a clear way. If, for people who are either coming from a Game of Thrones like passion for these elaborate fantasy worlds, or for people who have watched, these hours and hours and hours of manga series, these stories that build out these worlds and take these different twists and turns. The fact that these creators are doing this in the comics form is a remarkable achievement. And again, I come back to part of the appeal for this for me is what Marjorie Liu is able to do in terms of, showing and commenting on wrestling with demons that are internal, that have to do with history, and also have to do with power, and have to do with nationhood and personhood and those kind of themes. There's we also have cute half animal, half human creatures, but it's very different from T-Dragon Society, where it's there's a whole lot of just monsters exploding out of somebody's chest and stuff like that in this text. And so it's doing a lot of things and also doing it's a world that's very different from your Game of Thrones worlds in terms of certain aspects of gender and identity and representation, and I really value that too. So but it's also doing the good things about that kind of stuff with its own force. So I have so much admiration for this book, and just kind of enjoy it on a month-to-month basis, even though I'm totally overwhelmed every single time I read it, being like, wow, this is bigger than I can handle right now.
Yeah, it is just pretty amazing. So I again, not my thing. I'm not a Game of Thrones person, but I do really see the value in this. And so, boy, we're really going to change gears now. And the last text that we're going to talk about today is Tillie Walden's second offering, Spinning, which came out to a lot of fanfare. Tillie Walden began in the independent comic scene and self-published for a while, and then published out of a British publishing firm, and then got picked up by First Second for this and another text. And I have to say that, in the realm of memoir comics, this really is a pretty stunning text. And Tillie Walden also has that ability that I think we've been valuing today, to create an understanding both of mise-en-scene, in this instance, the many boring, mundane hours that people spend becoming really talented at a particular thing, such as, in this case, ice skating. And the way in which it can actually take over your life, take over your relationships, and really be a complicated endeavor. And I do want to sort of mention that I had read all of Walden's work prior to coming to spinning. Good Lord, spinning. Good one, Gwen. And I was really impressed both by her treatment of LGBTQ themes, which also comes through in this, since this is, after all, a memoir, but also of her handling of just the intricate way that people get to know each other, and once they know each other, sometimes can push each other's buttons. She's just really, really good at sort of drawing that through. So I had read everything she had done from Avery Hill Publications, again, that British firm. And so I was excited about Spinning. And I think that in some ways it definitely achieves what I think she sets out to do, which is to to sort of chronicle a period in her life where her entire existence was based upon competitive, both competitive in terms of individual competition with skating, but also being part of a synchronized skating team. And interestingly, I actually know, well, first of all, you should know Western Michigan University used to have one of the best synchronized skating teams in the country. It's unfortunately since disbanded, but they were amazing. And I often had many students who were in synchronized skating, and they worked extremely hard. So first of all, a hat tip to that. But also, my cousin's best friend was a synchronized skater, so I used to go to a lot of synchronized skating performances. And they're a lot like gymnastics in that there are certain things that the skaters need to do in unison that look weird or strange, but to the judges are super important. And the way that we enter into this world with Tilly is by getting a sense for the way in which coaches, sometimes almost abusively, work to get these young women to focus, to concentrate, and to work together as a team. It's a mainly black and white and gray palette. It's a somber text. In that sense, its mood reminded me a lot of Lewis Undercover. But it definitely has, achieved a certain level of acclaim. And it's understandable as to why. It's really a pretty stunning book. So, so that's my read on it. And I wasn't at all surprised to see it in this category. And I will not be at all surprised to see that it wins, because there's a tradition in the Eisners of single author created memoir comics doing very, very well in the YA category and in the intermediate category. I'm thinking of Ghosts, etc. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. But
yeah, it wouldn't surprise me either, and also because it's what a singular achievement it is, despite it looking and feeling a lot like those other things. It's also unique and uniquely Tilly Walden. Derek and I it's good to hear all those thoughts about it. I did wonder what your response was to the book. Derek and I got to review it on an episode, and we can link to the show notes, but not of the Young Readers series, but of just sort of the regular Comics Alternative Weekly Review episodes on Wednesdays. And, in that, I think I talked a little bit about Tilly Walden, being so remarkable for having just sort of entered the scene. But like you said, I loved her books from Avery Hill, and they're really, astounding. And this is also a really amazing achievement. Fitting that I think First Second can kind of bring it to a wider readership, but also, hopefully it will point back to all those great books that she did with Avery Hill and on her own. And I think Walden's increasing prominence is deserved for the quality of the stuff. I mean, in the months since reading this book, it's again one of those books that has lingered for me, like Nightlights did and so on, other things that we read last year, because Walden is so good at making these moments that stretch, with their silence, with the sort of the kind of feelings that are densely packed into the way that space and rhythm is distributed in this sometimes empty ice skating rink, or, these moments that she has with friendships that are dissipating or whatever. Just a really, really, really powerful book. And, I loved it as well. So, I kind of agree. I mean, we're probably not going to, put bets on anything here today, too much, but I do think it's, even if it doesn't win the Eisner, it's going to be a standout book that we'll look back on years and say that both because of Walden's significance and because of its own merits, this was a big one this year.
Well, just to give our readers a sense for this too, there's one scene that's definitely stayed with me, and it's when Tilly and her family moved to Austin, and she's starting at a new rink. And there's a disconnect between the way the adults think that young people will get along and the reality of what it is to actually be a young woman, especially walking into a locker room with a bunch of other highly competitive skaters, and they're all going to be sizing you up. No one speaks to her, but there's this disconnect between her dad and the rink manager saying, "Oh, you'll have a great time, and the girls will teach you everything," and her going in and sort of no one speaks to her, but she figures out her name simply by observation, not because anyone has spoke to her. And then under their scrutiny, her first, skate isn't wonderful by any stretch. And when her dad comes to pick her up, he said, "How did it go?" And she just says, "Fine, let's go." And in that sort of segment of the text, you really get a sense for the fissure between the adult world and the kid world, and the way that the things that Tilly will share with her family and the things that she doesn't. And it just felt very real to me, that segment. It again showing sort of the interiority of her thoughts, of what we know about her through what she's shown us as a narrator, or through the narration, and what her parents don't know, based upon how she behaves. And of course, there are other secrets that she ends up dealing with as well, including, her feelings for young women, et cetera, her own sense of sexual orientation, et cetera, that, is so anyway. I just found it to be a really great text. And honestly, if Lewis Undercover hadn't come along, I would be, but,
that's what it takes
but in some ways they share a lot in common. They share a color palette in common. And, and in many ways they share a protagonist who is trying very hard to find sort of, balance in a world where there's a lot of stress. It may be stress from different reasons, but at one point Tilly says the other girls always seemed so much more confident, so much more grown up. And she said, I never ignored the fact that I was attracted to them. I had known I was gay since I was 5. Now I was almost 12. A teacher aide had shown me how to hold your sleeve when you put your jacket on. I still remember her hands on my shoulders. I didn't have a word to describe it yet, but in that moment I knew. And there's this sort of beautiful way that she puts forward these very personal moments, but also you never lose track of the child who's the character. There's not, to me, sometimes that can be the problem with memoir comics when the adult is so far removed from the child. You very often get that sense of distance. I will say, Tilly Walden's quite young. Yeah. She's describing things that didn't happen I was thinking about this recently. The older you get, the more I think you start thinking about perspective and memory. Sure. And I was just recently talking to a student who's 24, and she was talking about her childhood, and I realized that for her, that still has a very strong tie. There, not that much has intervened between, say, being 16 and being 25. I'm 54. Yeah. There's a lot that's intervened, and I realized that I've lost probably forever personally that ability to go back and really know who I was as a kid. But I think Walden, both because of her talent as an artist, but also, quite frankly, because of her proximity to her own youth, is really able to add an authenticity that sometimes is lacking in the way that adults portray young people. So. Or older adults. No, I absolutely agree. That's part of the power of this text. There is enough distance for art to do its thing, but it's close enough that the immediacy of the experience is the sort of power of that experience is still bristles in the art. It's great. Wow. Yeah. Well, we survived. I hope you did too.
At this moment, I just step back to think, Gwen, this is like, if we had these books 20, even 10 years ago and said, like, this is the state of young readers comics, we'd just be thrown out of our chairs, right? The kind of variety and the kind of depth. And, one angle for me thinking about these, I talk often about being a parent reading with my kid, but another angle, which I think about these texts often, is that for years I've been a reading teacher, an English teacher, for adolescents. And a lot of times for adolescents that are categorized or classed as struggling readers in some sense, who are placed in intervention classes. And I remember starting teaching, 15 years ago, and so many of the texts that were quote unquote remedial texts that were sort of like simplified language, were insultingly dumbed down in terms of their content, in terms of their themes, in terms of the angles of life and the parts of the world that they explored. And, graphic novels were an alternative to that, but not only enjoy my daughter reading any of these texts at whatever age that she encounters them, I would also feel the same about different readers, not only struggling readers, but all kinds of readers, that I work with in schools today. And just the power, the range, the amounts of things, the variety of things that they accomplish. It's just, a different field.
Well,
we're
one of the
now.
best points that we can look at happened earlier this month in terms of I think our sense that children's comics and young adult comics are not only here to stay, but that they're going to continue to be a major part of the market. And that's that Penguin Random House hired away from First Second Gina Gagliano to become the director of a children's and young adult imprint there. And I'm actually on First Second's webpage, and there's a lovely letter that Mark Siegel, who's the editorial and creative director, and Callista Brill, the editorial director, left on their blog about Gina leaving. And they said, it's with some bittersweet feelings that we're writing to you today to let you know that Gina Gagliano will be leaving First Second for the next chapter in her career with Penguin Random House. There are many factors we can all point to in the past years which have contributed mightily to the unfolding comics renaissance in America. From a string of great award-winning works to graphic novels that connect and resonate with all kinds of readers, an explosion of regional cons and trade shows to librarians, publishers, and journalists who have each propelled comics in 1,000 ways. And we think among these truly transformative factors, there is one that deserves to be known, and that is Gina Gagliano. And that's a beautiful thing to say, and it's true. We both have worked with Gina over the years, and she's been a wonderful friend to comics and to comics creators. And to me, even though I feel sorry for First Second, I'm excited that they'll be able to hire someone in new, which is always exciting. But I'm excited for us, comics readers, because it's yet another imprint that's going to be coming out from a major publisher that shows that children's and YA comics are now going to be, I think, a permanent mainstay in children's and YA lit. And that makes me really excited, not only for Gina and for the praise that she so richly deserves, but frankly, for all of us who teach and read and enjoy children's and young adult comics. It's a wonderful sign that more and more publishers are investing. And that's so important for the artists, especially investing in really fine comics. And so, it's a nice way to end today's show, I think, with just a reflection that you're right, Paul. I mean, we are just an embarrassment of riches, and it's exciting,
That's well said and right on, both as a reflection of the industry and as a shout out to Gina, who we genuinely love and we're so excited
and Gina,
for.
we're 2 hours and 22 minutes into the show, so if you've lasted this long, woo!
Thank you for listening through all this. Right. But or you maybe you skipped right to this to hear us.
We'll
praises
mark
on
it
you
in the show notes.
In the show notes, that's right. But no, indeed, it's a reflection of the industry, and it is it's one that still has room for growth. We're excited about how much it's expanded. I'm struck, for instance, that there's a great sort of global presence, but not quite global in this list. There's a heavy European and Western sense to this list and all that. But nonetheless, I think we're looking at something that's changing underneath us, and that's awesome.
I agree. All right. Yeah. Well, whew. Let's wipe our brows here. Next month, we'll be back with a regular review show. I know, Paul, we're probably going to talk about Vera Brosgil's Be Prepared, which was a big release, and probably a couple other comics, so look for us in June. But in the interim, we want to remind folks to visit our sponsors, DCBS Service and their sister company, In Stock Trades, where you'll find lots of amazing comics priced from 20 to 50% off of list price. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of these books. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com, and on the right-hand side of your browser, you should see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own home, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or if you want to contact us the old school way, and by the way, I want to mention that in Bolivar, there is an old school telephone right on the mayor's desk. So maybe the mayor of New York City can call us at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. or you can contact us by email at twoguys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com, and Paul, how can people reach you?
Well, this will be a shock, but I'm Paul at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to our podcast and updates to our blog. We are now at ComicsAlt. That's our new handle on Twitter. We're also on social media on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, you name it, we're there. And so all kinds of outlets that you can find us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio. Hey, listen, if you are an Apple Podcast user, rate and review the podcast. That always sort of helps, and we'd love to hear your feedback there as well. You can support us on Patreon, where you can search us out at Comics Alternative. And always, Gwen, this has been a great time. People can go to comicsalternative.com to find our past episodes as well as all the other comics stuff that's there.
Right. And as we embark upon summer, let's do lots of reading this summer, both to our young listeners and to our adult listeners. There's lots of great children's and young adult comics to be reading all summer long. Yeah, that's right. So we'll see you next time. Yep. Until next time, I'm Paul. I'm Gwen. Bye-bye.